Good afternoon, and I want to thank everyone for being here. Public education is facing one attack after another, and since returning to office last January, President Trump has worked to dismantle the Department of Education. That's not a surprise because it was outlined on page 319 of Project 2025. Potentially what's more offensive about the entire effort is that congressional Republicans have just totally abdicated their Article 1 responsibilities and oversight to check what's going on. One core function of the Department of Education is to protect and defend students' civil rights. People look at it as an education agency, but basically it's a civil rights organization. The federal government must retain a central role of enforcing civil rights because historically, when states had no federal oversight, we saw segregation in public schools, a refusal to educate students with disabilities, and a lack of resources for low-income students. Since January 2025, nearly half the staff at the Office of Civil Rights have been fired. That's where you make a complaint to under Title VI. 7 of the 12 regional offices around the country have been closed, and without OCR functioning full capacity, students and families have had their cases that have already been filed abandoned and left without recourse to combat discrimination. In fact, the department has not resolved a sexual harassment or discrimination case since Trump returned to office. Weeks after they've returned to office, the administration fired nearly half the staff at ED, not just the Office of Civil Rights, but the entire department, sabotaging the department's ability to fulfill its other purposes to ensure that all students in America have equal access to a quality education. These actions, many of them were blocked in courts, and staff were retained, but the department prohibited them from coming to work. This means that valuable staff time went unutilized, and according to a recent GAO report, these firings cost the taxpayers over $28 million in staff just in the Office of Civil Rights, people who were on staff being paid, not coming to work. One of the hardest hit offices was the Institute of Education Sciences, IES, which oversees educational research and data collection. As of today, IES has only a handful of employees conducting research on learning trends, achievement gaps, and whether students are attending college compared to nearly 200 that were on staff before the cuts. In addition to firing staff, the Secretary of Education is attempting to offload core responsibilities across other federal agencies through legally dubious interagency agreements. Illegal transfers of these programs are not only extremely inefficient and wasteful, but will also result in inconsistent enforcement of federal education policy. Over and over again, the administration has circumvented the law to hamstring the future of public education without the consent of Congress or the American people. The Democrats are committed to fighting back against this war on education and securing a better future for our students. And that's why I'm so grateful that we have leaders here that have joined the fight to discuss how we can protect public education. We have with us Ray Lee, who is currently the Policy Counsel for Education Equity at the NAACP Legal Defense Fund, the LDF. Prior to joining LDF, he served as an attorney with the Department of Education's Office of Civil Rights. We're also joined by Augustus Mays, EdTrust's Vice President for Partnerships and Engagement. Prior to joining EdTrust, he served as the Director of Policy and Outreach at WestEd. We're also joined by Ashley Harrington, Senior Policy Counsel at the NAACP Legal Defense Fund. Prior to joining LDF, she served as the Senior Advisor at the Department of Education. And finally, we welcome Rachel Homer, who serves as the Director of Democracy 2025 and a Senior Attorney at Democracy Forward. Prior to joining Democracy Forward as the Chief of Staff, prior to joining Democracy Forward as the Chief of Staff of the Office of General Counsel, she was Chief of Staff in the Office of General Counsel at the Department. of Education. Thank you so much for joining us today, and so we can discuss what they're doing and what we can do about it. We've been joined by Ms. Bonamici from Oregon and Ms. Grijalva from Arizona. Thank you. Ray, what do we need to know?
Good afternoon. My name is Ray Lee, and I'm a policy counsel at the Legal Defense Fund. And prior to joining LDF, I served as an attorney in the U.S. Department of Education's Office for Civil Rights. And as you know, OCR plays a critical, irreplaceable role in enforcement of anti-discrimination laws in our nation's schools, colleges, and universities. Congress created OCR when it created the Department of Education back in 1979, and OCR's mission is to ensure equal access to education and to promote educational excellence across the nation. The agency works towards this goal by investigating possible violations of key civil rights laws that include protections against discrimination on the basis of race, sex, disability, and age. LDF has long advocated for OCR funding to be increased to an adequate level. Funding for OCR has never been provided at a level that allows the agency to thoroughly investigate its growing backlog of cases. Prior to March 2025, OCR had 12 regional enforcement offices that employed around 600 attorneys that processed over 22,000 cases a year. In a typical year, if OCR caseloads in an office exceeded 30 cases per attorney, those offices would often request additional budget to hire more staff to better address those cases. In March 2025, the current administration attempted to fire nearly half of the attorneys at OCR and closed 7 of the 12 regional offices. After these office closures, attorneys in several of the remaining offices had caseloads of well over 100 per attorney. So to put that on practical terms, that would mean each attorney would have to resolve a case every other working day of the year while receiving no new cases in order to clear their dockets. That's impossible. In the shuffle of these office closures, real harm is being experienced by students. The handoff of these cases from OCR attorneys that were laid off to those that remain had been thwarted by the administration, including by cutting off employees from key internal systems that they needed and delaying in the reassignment of cases. Devastatingly, the public bears the consequences of this disruption. Many complainants have not received any updates on their cases, including the status of those cases, what office is handling those cases, and who they should even contact to get more information. Stories of delayed cases are everywhere, including in litigation files related to court challenges to these layoffs. One such case includes a mother whose child was being harassed every day at school simply because he was black. The mother tried to talk to school leadership. The administration did nothing. She filed an OCR complaint. And unfortunately, the attorney who was assigned to that case was fired, and that office was closed. In between the day of the RIF notice and when the layoff was actually set to be in effect, the attorney was actually able to watch emails come in from this mother, but they were prohibited from responding. 2 weeks ago, the GAO released a report highlighting the failures of this attempted dismantling of OCR. Nearly 50% of OCR staff were given RIF notices and placed on administrative leave, and the GAO estimates that ED paid up to $38 million in salary in 6 months for those on administrative leave for employees that were legally prohibited for doing work for the agency. We are extremely concerned that also from March 2025 to September 2025, that same report found that OCR received more than 9,000 cases of alleged discrimination. OCR resolved 7,072 of those cases, but notably of those resolutions, 90% were resolved through dismissals prior to investigation. That means that 6,353 complaints were uninvestigated by OCR with no hope of administrative relief for those complainants. And we're extremely concerned of what this means for OCR to actually uphold its statutorily defined duty of protecting the civil rights of students in schools, including the rights of black students, other students of color, girls, women, students with disabilities, and members that identify with the LGBTQI+ communities. For example, in the first year of this administration, OCR has only entered into 2 resolution agreements related to racial harassment in schools. During the first year of the first Trump administration, OCR entered into 34 racial harassment resolutions. Students deserve better. LDF believes that Congress must act to ensure that EdOCR continues to fulfill its stated mission. While OCR was not included in this recent set of interagency agreements, Congress must ensure that OCR remains in a functioning Department of Education and not transferred to DOJ or some other agency. Additionally, Congress must assure adequate funding for OCR to ensure they can work through their backlog of cases. And Congress must also play an important role in transparency, sending oversight request letters to get information on the quantity of complaints that are being received, the types of discrimination that they allege, how OCR is processing those complaints, and what bases of dismissal are. So thank you, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you. Mr. Mays.
Yes, Congressman Scott, members of the House Democratic Caucus, thank you for the opportunity to speak with you today. As Congressman Scott said, my name is Augustus Mays, and I'm the Vice President of Partnerships Engagement at EdTrust. EdTrust is a national nonprofit organization focused on closing opportunity gaps and advancing racial and economic justice in education. We believe education is not just a pathway, it's a civil right. The Department of Education has been charged with clearing those pathways and enforcing those rights for over 4 decades. But under this administration, educational access for too many students, especially students of color, students from low-income backgrounds, multilingual learners, and students with disabilities, are hanging by a thread. Over the last year, we have witnessed an unprecedented assault on public education from the Trump administration that will have devastating long-term impacts and effects for generations. Over the course of the prior year, the Trump administration has delayed or canceled over $12 billion of federal education funding that supports teacher preparation, mental health supports, before and after school programs, civil rights enforcement, and access to public education for underserved students, to only name a few. The impact of these actions is a loss of services and supports for millions of students. And the administration's campaign to dismantle public education goes beyond just cutting funding. Last year, Congress passed the reconciliation law that includes an unprecedented private school voucher tax scheme that will provide billions for private school access for wealthy families. Furthermore, the legislation includes devastating cuts to SNAP, to Medicaid, that will destroy state budgets and deny students and families access to food and health supports. The attacks on public education escalated in November when the administration announced their intentions to unlawfully dismantle the Department of Education and sell it for parts. By fragmenting programs and sending them to agencies that do not do core functions of educational services to districts and schools, we are now seeing cities, school districts, and states will have to navigate multiple agencies and funding and go unaware of the funding status of those particular funding streams because they're at different agencies. Technical assistance that they're used to being provided will go away, and legal guidance for programs will also be delayed. As funding shifts into systems and agencies not built for education, we're obviously going to see bottlenecks that will arise. We've already seen and heard about grant stalling. We've heard and seen states and districts facing conflicting rules and new systems. And we have also are worried about federal dollars may being lapsed for reaching students, like we saw last summer when the administration illegally withheld funding for after-school programs and English learners, and did that on ideological grounds and not based on law, not based on legal precedent. We've already seen the problems created for states and districts in the wake of these illegal transfers of the Office of Career and Technical and Adult Education to the Department of Labor last summer. States reported technical problems, communication lapses, bureaucratic hurdles, and delays in funding. This approach treats K-12 students as widgets to be plugged into a job training system that has little to do with assisting homeless youth or supporting of the arts. So we have to be very clear about this, right? Our students from low-income backgrounds and students of color are going to be the learners who are most impacted by these illegal actions. We expect additional transfers in the coming weeks, despite the fact that as recently as last week, the President signed into law a bipartisan appropriations bill that prohibits the transfer of funding from the Department of Education to other federal agencies, and added report language stating that there's no authority that allows them to take these actions. Finally, by encouraging states to request waivers from the Every Student Succeeds Act, the administration is potentially allowing low-performing schools to be hidden from view and vital funding streams dedicated to historically underserved students, including rural students and students of color, to be block granted. We are speaking out against those policy choices and will be watching closely as more waiver requests are filed. So make no mistake, we are living in what Ed Trust calls the Great American Heist, but we stand ready to fight for the future of public education and reimagine a system where investments are increased, civil rights are protected, privatization is rejected, and opportunities expanded for students of color and students from low-income backgrounds at every level in every zip code. So our students, the nation's greatest resource, deserve nothing less. So thank you for the opportunity to join this conversation, and I look forward to your questions.
Good afternoon. Ranking Member Scott, members of the committee, thank you for the opportunity to speak here today. The role of the Department of Education in expanding access and opportunity in higher education cannot be understated. Every year, the department awards over $120 billion in grants, work-study funds, and loans to roughly 13 million students. It processes more than 17 million FAFSA forms each year, enabling millions of students and families to access federal aid and pursue higher education. It also manages the $1.6 trillion federal student loan portfolio that 43 million Americans are relying on as they continue to try to manage the burden of student debt. Through the Office of Federal Student Aid, the Office of Post-Secondary Education, and the Office of Career and Technical Education, ED provides critical support to students, institutions, and states to advance student success, post-secondary educational access, workforce development, and institutional stability. Each of these departments, though, saw a substantial loss in personnel with last year's reductions in force. The administration's efforts to dismantle the department are already causing financial aid instability, lapses in enforcement of civil rights laws and campus safety measures, lapses in critical oversight of institutions and loan servicers, and reduced data transparency. For students, FAFSA delays or inability to access aid can mean postponing enrollment, stopping out mid-program, or foregoing college altogether. Even if students are able to remain in school, it can lead to homelessness and food insecurity. And for institutions, it means operational uncertainty and mounting compliance risk. These impacts will fall most acutely on the students and institutions most reliant on federal support to pursue and provide higher education. This includes Black students and other students of color, low-income students, first-generation students. It also includes institutions that serve these students and have been critically underfunded for decades, like historically Black colleges and universities. Any delays in funding or miscommunication will result in direct harms to these students and institutions. Minority-serving institutions like predominantly Black institutions, which also serve a disproportionate share of students of color and low-income students, are also feeling the impact of losing millions of dollars because of ED's unilateral decision to stop dispersing congressionally mandated grant aid. Equity risks are not theoretical. Delays, inconsistent guidance, and reduced oversight can and will translate into real enrollment and completion losses. The six IAAs, the six interagency agreements spoken about today, transfer grant administration responsibilities for a large number of department programs to the Department of Labor, Department of Interior, Department of State, and the Department of Health and Human Services. And while these agencies all provide important services for our nation, none of them are adequately prepared to take on the massive portfolio of programs that these interagency agreements strip from ED. These agencies are already short-staffed. For example, almost 20% of the Department of Labor staff accepted the Trump administration's resignation offer last year. They also lack the institutional knowledge that career employees at the department have amassed from decades of running these grant programs. These agreements will also require significant technological changes and system updates, none of which are simple or easy, nor cheap. All of this will take money, time, and resources. The magnitude of these transfers is staggering. If these interagency agreements are fully implemented, the Department of Labor will be dispersing more education funding than labor funding. The administration has also floated moving the $1.6 trillion federal student loan portfolio to the Small Business Administration or to the Treasury. This will directly impact the 43 million borrowers across this country. And though this move has not actually been made, the announcements themselves have created chaos and confusion for borrowers and servicers alike. This leads to servicing errors, repayment issues, and ultimately more borrowers in delinquency and default. None of these changes improve the efficiency or effectiveness of government programs meant to ensure equal educational opportunities. These changes will not help schools, districts, families, or states. At best, these changes would just add more layers of bureaucracy and more red tape between schools and the federal funding that Congress has promised them. These are just more steps towards the ideological goal of dismantling the Department of Education and limiting opportunity instead of ensuring equal opportunity. We also have to think about these efforts in conjunction with the major overhaul in higher education funding required under the One Big Beautiful Bill. Major changes to federal aid availability, student loan repayment, institutional economy, and Pell programs require dedicated, knowledgeable staff to implement and communicate them effectively. We urge lawmakers to protect the department and hold it accountable for carrying out its statutory responsibilities and requirements. A fully resourced department is essential to providing equal opportunity. Thank you.
Thank you. Before we get to Ms. Homer, I want to recognize Mark Giacano from California, Johanna Hayes from Connecticut. Ms. Homer.
Thank you. I'm Rachel Homer of Democracy Forward, and thank you for having us. Thank you for focusing on this essential issue, and thank you for your time today. Previously, I served as the Chief of Staff of the General Counsel's Office of the Department of Education. And that's what brings me here today to talk about our litigation to protect the Department of Education. We at Democracy Forward are proud to be leading the case challenging this dismantling of the Department of Education. Our case has been consolidated with the State Attorney General's case on this, and we're proud to be working with them on it. These are the only two cases that are challenging as a whole the effort to dismantle the Department of Education, and they are crucial in fighting back in what this administration is trying to do, in addition to the numerous other cases around the country that are challenging particular parts of this effort. In our case, we are honored to represent 2 school districts in Massachusetts, a broad coalition of educators and school staff, as well as the ARC, a national advocacy group representing students with disabilities. The core of our case is about how the administration is violating the law, and most importantly, how that is harming students, schools, parents, teachers, and our entire community. As you all know, Congress decides what agencies exist. Congress creates agencies. Congress charges those agencies with performing certain functions. Congress determines the mission of those agencies. And the executive branch's obligation is to carry that out. It's to implement those laws faithfully. Congress created the Department of Education in 1979 through the Department of Education Organization Act. And Congress has not abolished the department, despite considering that issue multiple times since then. When Congress created the Department of Education, in its findings, it explicitly said that the nation would be served by having all of these different functions in one agency under one secretary who reports directly to the president, not in multiple agencies under interagency agreements, not dispersed throughout the entire federal government, but in one agency, because that is what's needed to best serve our nation, our students, our parents, our teachers, and our community. In addition to that Department of Education Organization Act in 1979, since then, Congress has passed more than 50 statutes, creating more than 100 programs that the department is obligated to implement. The department is obligated to spend the funds, whether that's through grants or other implementation activities. The department is obligated to do these crucial activities that are necessary to support our nation's students. And as you've heard from my colleagues today, what the department's core mission is to ensure that every student, regardless of their background, is able to obtain that necessary, essential education. How that happens is up to the local communities, it's up to the local schools, it's up to the states, but that baseline is something that every student in this country is entitled to. And it does that through OCR, through ensuring that discrimination doesn't interfere with any student's ability to receive that education. It does that through grant programs. It does that especially through grants that ensure that students from a low-income background, whether that's rural, whether that's urban, whether that's any of the different types of students in this broad and diverse nation, are able to get that education. It ensures that students with disabilities are able to get the education that they are entitled to by law, and it does that through not only grants and providing essential funding to communities and to states, but also through working with schools and working with states and working with parents and teachers. Through that technical assistance, through that essential oversight and implementation work, through working in partnership with all of the parts of the education system around the country to make sure that that education really is provided and is of a high quality. So when this administration attempts to dismantle the Department of Education, it's not about specific details of laws, although of course it is also about that as a lawyer. It's about what they're trying to do to undermine the Department of Education's essential work to educate our country's students and to support schools, communities, states, parents in doing so. Here, as you all have seen, the Department of Education fired nearly half of the staff initially in March. It was very explicit that its purpose in doing so was to dismantle the Department of Education, and that was followed by an executive order making that formal. We filed our lawsuit very quickly, along with the AGs who we're working very closely with. The only court that has ever considered the substance of those claims is the district court in Massachusetts, which issued a detailed and thoughtful opinion and agreed with us nearly entirely and issued an injunction stopping the Department of Education from being dismantled. Unfortunately, the Supreme Court in July temporarily stayed that injunction, so the department has been able to continue its effort at dismantling since that decision was issued. The case is ongoing. We are now back in the district court. We are still fighting, and we can still make progress through the courts, but unfortunately the Supreme Court has allowed that effort to continue while the case is ongoing. Thank you again for having us, and we welcome your questions.
Thank you. Thank you. And we'll have questions from the panel. Who wants to be first? Yes, nobody wants to volunteer. I'll be up. Okay.
Thank you, Ranking Member Scott, for gathering us for this really critical discussion, and thank you to each of you on the panel. The experience and expertise that you bring is so important for us to hear. And so the proposed dismantling of the Department of Education is not a step towards efficiency. We all know that. It is a step in a retreat from the national commitment to every student. Scattering programs across multiple agencies will not reduce bureaucracy. It will increase waste, create confusion, and weaken enforcement of federal education policy. Shifting K-12 oversight to agencies without education expertise risks serious, lasting harm. So my first question would be to Ray on disability rights. What are the specific risks to the Enforcement of Individuals with Disabilities Act, IDEA, if there's no central federal agency to oversee state compliance?
Yeah, definitely. So there's a very strong system, as you mentioned, of federal rights for students with disabilities, and OCR actually processes typically hundreds of these to resolution, thousands of these complaints, but enters into hundreds of these cases a year. And it's actually the one place where you actually see, regardless of who is in control of the Department of Education, regardless of what party, those cases tend to move forward, especially what we call FAPE cases, which are cases where students are being denied free and appropriate public education. So for some reason, a student with disability, there's a problem with their IEP plan being implemented with 504 accommodations, all of those. And so in this administration, we're still seeing those cases going through. There's about 83 that have been processed, and that's a reason why OCR funding is so important. You hear the big headlines about a lot of the politically motivated cases and the controversial cases that are coming out of OCR, especially those targeting trans students, those that are targeting DEI policies. But a lot of the bread and butter of the agency is resolving these individual complaints for individual students that need access to the classroom. And that's something that OCR typically does. They're short-staffed now, so you see that number about. It's not a coincidence that it's about half or less than half of what it normally is, because the people that used to do this were on administrative leave. There's confusion among the chains. And it's a role that DOJ also plays, but it does very differently. DOJ has a role in larger systemic cases, but when it comes to an individual student who's being denied from the classroom, those cases have typically been in control for OCR, and really important for OCR to maintain that function.
Thank you. Ms. Harrington, as a former senior advisor to the Department of Education, what would happen to the administration of Pell Grants and federal student loan portfolio if the department no longer existed?
It will absolutely result in delays in people's ability to access important critical federal aid and in their ability to manage their student loans. We're already seeing this as different agencies have different programs have been moved around, as staff, critical staff who manage these contracts with loan servicers, for instance, or who work in the Ombudsman's office who help borrowers have been part of these reductions in force. So it means that critical protections and programs are not available for students, and for many low-income students and students of color, that means they will either drop out of school and never go back, or never make it to school to begin with, or if they're a student, they already have student loans, they may end up in delinquency or default, which can have catastrophic consequences.
Follow up that. What is it about a loan, other than issue the loan and pay it back, that's unique to student loans that you don't have in others, that you would need someone with some institutional knowledge to figure out?
As you know, sir, our federal student loan system is incredibly complex. It has so many different moving pieces in terms of the repayment plans, how the aid is dispersed, in terms of forbearance deferment options, forgiveness options, opportunities for students who have been defrauded by their schools, opportunities for students who have went to a closed school for them to get relief, folks who are permanently disabled to get relief. So there's a lot of work that happens at the Office of Federal Student Aid, and it's not just giving out the money. It is maintaining that money. It's communicating with servicers who do the most of the back and forth with borrowers and making sure they have the right information to provide to borrowers and resolving things when they don't. And with the One Big Beautiful Bill, the federal student loan system is changing in a way that is going to operate in a way it has never done before. These are seismic changes. And if no one at the department or is given to another agency that has no experience, that will absolutely fall on the borrowers themselves and the students who are trying to pursue higher education.
Mr. Mays, based on your work with EdTrust, what are the projected consequences for Title I funding and low-income school districts, like many of the ones in my district, if federal education oversight is eliminated?
It would be chaos, but I want to say it would be design chaos if the Department of Education goes away, as this administration wants to see. Again, as I mentioned in my remarks, the federal role over the past 40 years has really played three primary responsibilities. One is civil rights protection, the civil rights agency that Ranking Member Scott mentioned. Two, in this context around Title I, in regards to your question, it's really about providing resources in a targeted way to the students who need it most. So if you were to take away the Department of Ed and, as this administration has been saying, return education back to the states, what you will see is that states will then not be held accountable for ensuring that those resources are going to the most neediest students in those districts. Two, the other role that the department plays is around data and transparency. So then it'll be the responsibility of the state to track how those dollars are going towards, let's say, a reading coach, or going towards providing other academic supports like high-intensity tutoring, right? We won't know how those dollars are getting to those kids, and then we won't be able to understand what interventions or what other types of strategies districts and schools, which, educators, superintendents all rely on that data. And so that will then just dilute the intentionality around addressing inequities. And so if that happens, I think we can know what states did prior to the inception of the department and prior to civil rights laws and others that have been enacted by Congress. A lot of states will ignore their responsibility to provide a high-quality education for all kids, and we will see disparities grow even more, and for those students who have been historically marginalized for decades.
Thank you. I was asking Ranking Member Scott if I have time for another question, because I could probably ask you a lot of them. So for Ms. Homer, given your experience in the Office of the General Counsel, what happens to active litigation or consent decrees held against the department if the agency is dissolved?
Well, about 4/5 of the attorneys in the Office of General Counsel have been subject to the RIF. So we already are in a situation where the department is just sorely lacking legal staff. And as your question indicates, the legal staff are just essential for the department to do its work. They're essential to work with the Department of Justice in the litigation that the Department of Education is part of. They're essential for working with the Office for Civil Rights in consent decrees and other enforcement matters, and they're essential for just the routine work of the department, making sure that the department follows the law and making sure that the department can provide the technical assistance to the states and the schools and the other grantees that those grantees need to be able to comply with the education laws. So really, schools, states, and communities are really suffering from the gutting of the attorneys at the Department of Education.
I yield back.
Thank you, Ranking Member Scott, for bringing us together, but thank you so much to all of you who are here to talk about this critical issue. I know I don't just speak for myself when I say I can't believe we're here having to actually defend the existence of the Department of Education. As Education Committee members, we came here to work on improving education and opening doors of opportunity and addressing the civil rights disparities, but here we are having to defend the actual existence of the Department of Education. Have any of your organizations heard about whether the Department of Education still plans to move the Office of Special Education and Rehabilitative Services to HHS? And if so, have you heard anything about the timing of that? And what I know you answered, Mr. Lee, what the consequences might be without those services, but there was some talk about perhaps moving to HHS, which makes me incredibly nervous. So has anyone heard about that?
I mean, we had heard before the holiday break in December that there was going to be attempts to move the Office of Special Education as well as other functions like OCR over to the Department of Justice. And so, we are, as an advocacy community, anticipating and waiting for that shoe to drop, per se. Again, we're trying to make sure that we educate the public, we educate members, of the harms around that, but
I'm equally concerned about moving to the Department of Justice as to HHS.
Yeah. And again, just trying to make sure that everyone understands that those aren't the core functions of those agencies.
Exactly.
And that it will do really great harm to communities and families and students, most importantly.
Well, one of the things I already moved was Office of Career, Technical, and Adult Education over to Labor. And have you heard anything about how that is affecting current technical education programs? Because they're not set. Labor's not set up to do that. We had conversations about that. It's current technical education. It belongs in the education department. Have you heard about how that's going and whether schools are accessing CTE dollars?
I think we've heard, and that it has been very rocky. It has been very hard. There's been a ton of delays in entities being able to access their funding. There was an after-action report that the department carried out on its own that looked at that transfer, and it found there was all sorts of problems because of the technical difficulties of switching this program, changing grants management systems. And so while some of these have been, they figured out a way to get around them, I've heard that there are still states and systems that have not received some of their funding. And so it's a big undertaking to try to move so quickly.
It's chaotic and it's inefficient. Those programs belong at the Department of Education with the resources and the expertise there. I just had a meeting this afternoon with some financial aid administrators at two of the institutes of higher education in Oregon. They are extremely concerned about phasing out grad plus loans. And I think I'll ask you, Ms. Harrington, because you kind of focused on higher ed. The significance of this is really, really serious, because what's going to happen without the grad plus loans is somebody wants to go to graduate school. Okay, if you're wealthy, or you're going to have to go to the private loan market, and somebody with a consumer protection background, that makes me really nervous. So what are your thoughts on grad plus loans, and what is this going to mean for people who have that goal of furthering their higher education?
Yeah, we are deeply concerned about the changes, the student loan changes out of One Big Beautiful Bill, particularly the changes around graduate education funding. We know that disproportionately students of color, women, Black students, low-income students rely on that funding to be able to pursue education, to pursue essential careers like nursing, teaching, social work. And so
that are, I might add, professional careers.
Professional careers. And so we actually just sent a comment up with our partners at National Women's Law Center, Lawyers Committee, and 48 other orgs with our concern about how the department is proposing to define professional degrees. I think the limits and changes in OBBB are bad enough, and the department's proposal will make that worse, and that will be felt not just by those individuals, but by the communities that they're trying to serve.
And I think about the remarks that President Johnson made when he signed the Higher Education Act. It's about opening doors of opportunity and the windows there. One of the things, Ms. Harrington, is that I call it the big bad ugly bill, not the big bad beautiful bill. I just put that on the record. One of the things too, when we hear about we want to give education back to the states, and we know what they're really meaning is curriculum, and that is already up to the states and school boards, not up to the federal government. But one place where the federal government really does make a difference is IES and that research to support the best practices. And does anybody want to comment about what it means with the cuts to IES and how that affects the decisions that are being made at the local level?
I think that's right to your point, right? Like, research and data and how it's used has always been important, but the federal role in making sure that it's nonpartisan, that it's addressing regional and local needs has been something that, districts and schools across this country have been leveraging for decades. And if that goes away, and with the cancellation and delay of the grants to IES that has, taken our research agenda and had stopped it, I think it gets to your point around, like, how are we tracking students? Right. How are we knowing which interventions are working and for whom? And then how are we leveraging that information or that data to actually scale up evidence-based practices and approaches that are actually delivering on outcomes?
It's so important. Many of us are former state legislators. State legislatures don't have additional resources to help fill those gaps. One more question, Ms. Homer. Thank you so much to Democracy Forward for everything you're doing. Thank you for taking on the big lawsuit challenging the actual dismantling. Were you involved in the anti-DEI lawsuit as well? Because it's my understanding that there was a ruling that the anti-DEI policies are a violation of the First Amendment, and that the Department of Education did not appeal that. Is that your understanding? Were you involved in that? Because that seems like, okay, let's take a victory when we can get it, but I wonder if that's the end of that.
You are absolutely right that that's a victory, and you're right that it's the end. There were 3 separate lawsuits challenging that Dear Colleague letter. We led one of them. LDF led another one. All 3 of them won at the district court level. That's how illegal the department's actions were. Right. In our case, it reached a final judgment. The department initially appealed, and they have since dropped that appeal. That happened in late January. So that means that the court's order that Dear Colleague letter is illegal, that anti-DEI Dear Colleague letter is illegal, that is now final. The department is no longer challenging it. They cannot enforce that Dear Colleague letter anywhere across the country.
I think I'll end on that note. Thank you. I yield back.
Thank you. Been joined by my colleague from Virginia, Don Byer, who will call on in just a minute. Meanwhile, gentleman from California, Mr. Takano.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Scott. Mr. Ranking Member, thank you all for being here, and thank you to the Ranking Member for finally giving this committee the opportunity to fully discuss what the gutting of the Department of Education will mean for all American students and families. Now, since March, the department has lost thousands of employees who were fired, pushed out, or forced into retirement. And I asked the witnesses, the Trump administration believes that getting rid of the department is just getting rid of bureaucracy. How are students, families, and teachers feeling the impact of a gutted department 1 year in? Anybody jump in if you have a thought about it. Mr. Lee, go ahead.
Yeah, I will say they're not facing less bureaucracy. They're often facing more bureaucracy, definitely at the school level. But when it comes to students and families, what they're seeing with OCR is they were already dealing with an agency that wasn't equipped to fully handle all of the complaints that were coming in due to funding constraints and staffing constraints. And so there were long delays on having their complaints heard. Now those delays are doubled, tripled, or in many cases, they're hearing radio silence. And so there are a lot of students and families across the country who've experienced real discrimination in the classroom, who've had racial slurs hurled at them, who've experienced sexual assault on campuses, that have filed complaints with the Department of Education, and they've heard nothing, and they don't know where else to turn, and they don't know why it's happening. That they haven't been hearing.
To be clear, OCR stands for the Office of Civil Rights. You're saying that office was already understaffed before there were massive cuts, and that when that is the office that students go to when they have been discriminated against, when they've been harassed for a variety of reasons, whether it's sexual harassment, whether it's being harassed based on their ethnicity or race or gender. And you're saying that there are now huge caseload backlogs because the staffing has been cut so severely.
Yeah, absolutely. And some of these were cases midstream. And so there was actually reporting back in April, I believe, of an example of a case in the news where a family had their child had various disabilities that led to their school secluding that child from the classroom. And they had filed a complaint with OCR. OCR had managed to get a mediation on the calendar with the district to try to resolve these claims, and the attorney that set that up was fired, and nobody was able to then do the mediation, and that case sat for months and months, and we don't know where it's been or even if it's been reassigned. So even cases that were midstream in the process of resolution, these abrupt cuts and illegal reductions in force led to families totally in disarray when it came to real complaints and real harms to kids.
Wow. Well, that is such a terrible thing to think that students who've been discriminated against cannot depend on their government for a remedy. Secretary McMahon has proceeded with breaking up the Department of Education and transferring remaining offices to 6 different agencies through interagency agreements. I asked the witnesses, from what you've heard, are the IAAs, or interagency agreements, making the department's work more efficient as was promised? Go ahead, Ms. Harrington.
Absolutely not. We've heard it called, they've been detailing staff from Med, and we've called it doing the same job but in a different chair. Meanwhile, they can't actually get in the building, they can't use the Wi-Fi, so there's little ways this is inefficient. Bigger ways as well, because they're eventually going to have to switch grant management systems. They're going to have to learn a whole new program. The grantees are going to have to learn a whole new program. There's going to be a lot of money spent to create those systems. In the meantime, the folks, the grantees, have no way of actually asking questions, getting technical assistance. They have to send an email that just sits there. And that translates to less time that they can spend on student services, less time that they can spend on other functions of a university, because they're waiting on how to make a system work that should never have been moved or tried to move in the first place.
So thank you for that. Are there currently enough staff to adequately and appropriately disperse the funds that were appropriated in this year's Labor, Health, and Human Services appropriations bills? You're shaking your heads. Go ahead, Rachel, go ahead.
I'll let Ms. Harrington speak to the details of that. I'll just note that these transfers through the IAAs, they're illegal. That's not what Congress has set up. That's not how Congress has instructed the agencies to function. So we have added them to our lawsuit, and we look forward to challenging them in court.
Okay, great. So, Ms. Harrington, you want to just further comment on whether there's enough staff to disperse the funds that have been appropriated?
Absolutely not. Many of the departments and staff were already gutted by these illegal reductions in force, and now they're trying to send them to agencies that also don't have the resources, either of the internal knowledge or even just the staff itself, to manage these programs. So absolutely, this is increasing bureaucracy and increasing difficulty, not improving it.
And the other piece too, though, I think is important to note. Not only will they not have the capacity to distribute the funds, the other piece that you mentioned too earlier too is, once you distribute the funds, then if states have questions, if districts have questions around technical assistance or how they should be implementing the funds to actually improve outcomes for kids, that capacity within the department is completely gutted.
And of course, they want to stay in compliance because if they're out of compliance, we've seen how punitive this government can be if they accuse you of fraud, right? So if these funds don't go out, I would say the Department of Education is essentially, the department's essentially being set up to fail. Would you agree with me? You all nodded your heads. Thank you. I yield back, and I thank you for being here and answering our questions.
Thank you. Ms. Hayes.
Thank you all for being here. I feel like over the last year we have done a great job of doing a, if you will, forensic analysis on everything that this administration is doing and highlighting all of the examples of their attacks on both public education and the Department of Education. I'm from the state of Connecticut, so I guess I can say you're welcome and I'm sorry. But my question is, we know what the administration is doing. We can look at and point to examples in every department that falls under the Department of Education of the systemic dismantling of the services that allow students to thrive and get a high-quality education. My question to you today is, what are your thoughts? Have you begun to think about how we can slow this down until there's a change in leadership, and how we begin to put these things back together, what that looks like. I think that's what many people are afraid of. If this goes away, does it mean it's gone forever? Because these were long-fought battles, long-fought wins. It wasn't like someone woke up one day and said, we should create a department that provides education to all children. We know how we got here. So I think that it is debilitating to think that in 1 year and with the stroke of a series of executive orders, all of that work can be undone. So have you begun to think about what happens on the other side of this?
I can start with the efforts on slowing it down. We are using litigation, and many of our colleagues in the legal community are using litigation to slow this administration down, to stop the harm where we can, to hold them accountable, and to really, with the Department of Education, to protect students, schools, parents, and communities. We are proud to lead our lawsuit, but there are actually multiple other lawsuits as well. There's lawsuits challenging the effort to dismantle OCR. There's lawsuits specific to IES. There's the entire legal community is really rising up to fight back against what's happening, and that is slowing it down. It's not perfect. We are not having complete wins, but we are making progress.
Is there a clearinghouse for all of this information? Because I think that many people are unaware of the various ways and actions that are being taken. So for advocates and people out there who think that all is lost, there should be a place where you can point to one place that says this is a list of all the lawsuits that have been, a tracker, if you will.
So we actually provide that through Democracy 2025, which is a program of Democracy Forward that works to support the entire pro-democracy legal community. So we end up serving a role of supporting on the coordination on litigation, and we have a public-facing tracker that tracks all of these lawsuits.
Can you filter that out to the Department of Education?
Absolutely.
Okay. Anyone else on that question?
Yeah, and one thing, and this goes back to something that Rep. Bonamici brought up before, is that there have been a lot of high-profile actions outside of just dismantling the Department of Ed that have come out of OCR and guidance documents and things, and they make a big splash in the headlines when they come out, and then they get challenged in court, and they lose, and they get reversed, and there's no one really talking about it. And so that's a place where members of Congress, where advocates, where community members can do a lot of work in educating school boards, university leaders on what the state of play is. So, for example, this February 14th Dear Colleague letter from the Department of Education that made these broad sweeping claims about DEI and why it's illegal was, as Rachel said,
us to go educate the school board?
This is something any parent or student can do. Yeah, any student or parent can go to a school board and let them know. When the letter came out, a lot of school boards started reversing policies, and now that fight is done in the courts, we haven't seen them go back on that. And so that is something that is huge, and they're getting all of this chilling pressure from the administration, counter political pressure, whether it's from student voices or from members of Congress or other community members, is incredibly important in pushing back on some of that work that's already been done through litigation.
I appreciate that. I guess my response would be it's going to have to be also a community effort, because I think that I know specifically on the topic of education, people at home and around the country think, what is being done? Why isn't this at the top of the headlines? And here from our perch as members of Congress, there are so many competing crises, and everybody's talking about these things. So it really is going to take some outside mobilization and help with educating people in the community and parents and school boards and all of those things. And it's I know that as members of Congress, that's not something that, like I said, we're here fighting for our lives, your lives, the kids' lives, everything. So it really is a challenge in this moment.
And one thing I just want to say, in addition to what my two colleagues talked about in terms of slowing it down, I think also what you were getting at in your question is, how are we pulling it back together, but what does the future look like for reimagining the federal role and what education looks like? And obviously we've seen in the recent NAEP scores that reading and math has declined across many states, but there also have been states post-pandemic that have seen gains in those two core subject areas. So I think it's important as an advocacy community, as well as the members of Congress, to really uplift those bright spots where we see public schools delivering for students and families. And I think once we take the narrative back, because what this administration is trying to do by dismantling it at a breakneck speed without any thought, without any strategy, is to get people to think that the department's role in their child's life and their educational journey doesn't matter. And we got to take that narrative back, and that we do that by showing positive examples and outcomes of how public schools have delivered for kids. And so EdTrust and our partners are really going to work on that this year to really uplift those kind of bright spots and examples so that it's really concretely like something that my neighbor could understand, or someone who lives within our community could understand why the Department of Ed is really delivering for public schools and for kids.
Can I just offer one thing in closing for that? Because, as a classroom teacher, I spent many years in the classroom. I've lived through No Child Left Behind, Race to the Top, so many different programs. And when people reference NAEP scores, you have to overlay that with the environment on the ground. Teachers, schools, communities are living through decades of disinvestments where you've had coaches and programs and things that looked like they were beginning to work, and then the funding was cut, so you couldn't see the long-term success of these programs. So it is really difficult for people to just pull out these scores as a snapshot in time, not understanding what is actually happening on the ground. We went through a lot of this on committee when we were trying to allocate COVID funds. I mean, the digital divide, the access to resources, all of the things were so disparate from district to district, and you can't even use the word in a particular zip code, because there are places in my congressional district where I have some of the most exclusive boarding schools in the country and Title I lowest performing schools, most exclusive boarding schools in the world, Title I underperforming, lowest performing schools in the country, and they're in the same zip code. So even zip code isn't enough of a delineating factor. So I struggle when people talk about these scores as an indicator of student success without also understanding when you have one school, opening a hygiene closet and figuring out how kids are going to wash their clothes to be to school on time, and another school, their biggest struggle is trying to get SAT prep courses built in. It's not a level playing field. Again, I thank you for being here and for all your work in this area, and please don't concede before it's over. We have so much work to do and so many people depending on us to do it. I appreciate you.
Thank you. Don Beyer.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you for inviting me to be part of this. And first of all, I want to say how insecure I am coming after Johanna Hayes, who was the 2016 National Teacher of the Year and the Connecticut Teacher of the Year. So it's people put us in our place. And thank you very much to Democracy Forward, the NAACP, EdTrust for fighting for us. I really, really appreciate that. And Mr. Lee, thank you for bringing up the seclusion and restraint issue. We've been working with Chairman Scott now for years to try to Keep All Students Safe Act passed, and we're 36 weeks away from taking back the House, and that will be one of our highest priorities is to get that done. Which, by the way, as we know, overwhelmingly affects children of color and children with autism, children with multiple barriers to success to begin with. So I'm glad you're out there. Ms. Homer, so Democracy Forward has been a great gift to the country. We had breakfast, a bunch of us, with the Secretary McMahon, early in the year to express all of our concerns. And she said, don't worry, we're going to follow all the statutes. We're going to do exactly by the law. I'm assuming with your huge lawsuits that they haven't been doing that. But specifically, as we look forward to our own Project 2027, what should we be getting ready to do to make sure that some other dictatorial president doesn't do this kind of thing in the future?
Well, thank you for your kind words, and I agree they have not been doing it by the law, and in fact, a court agrees with us, which is why we're continuing to challenge it. In terms of going forward, I certainly want to hear what my fellow panelists have to say about what should be done to rebuild this, but I do think something that's crucial is making the laws even clearer. Congress has tried to speak quite clearly that the Department of Education needs to exist and it needs to perform these particular functions. So making that crystal clear, it's not other departments issuing grants, it's the Department of Education performing all of these functions. I think that's essential. And creating private causes of action that make it even easier to sue over those violations.
Great. Thank you very much. Ms. Harrington, another noble Virginian, Tim Kaine, was one of the Democratic senators that voted to reopen the government. And he did that because he got it included, the agreement that anybody fired or riffed during the shutdown would be hired back. It was public law, I actually have it written down here, 119-37. And we think the Department of Education violated the law in the first place by firing people during the shutdown. But do we have any knowledge, assurance that those people have been hired back, now that the shutdown was over? This is before the new shutdown. So.
I think the most recent folks, most of them have been brought back, but they've been shuffled around in a way that they're not doing their same jobs, or they're part of some of these new interagency agreements and being detailed to different agencies, so it still doesn't look the same. So I think really there still needs to be some more oversight there. And to both of your questions about what we do going forward, on the higher ed side, I think we are going to have to reinvest in making sure that folks have access to grant aid, fully have access to grant aid, making college actually more affordable. I think once these the changes in the reconciliation bill are fully implemented, college is going to be out of reach for a lot of folks. Student loans are going to be more expensive, and there's going to have to be steps taken to help all the borrowers who are going to be struggling as a result of these changes. So there's going to have to be a reimagining of how we do this. We're going to think about how we cancel and manage the student debt, and how we help the folks who are still trying to go to school or still in school actually be able to finish and stay in school so that they can then serve their communities.
Thank you very much. You know, when we met with the secretary, she said, well, don't worry, because we're going to move Title I to these folks and they can do it better, and we're going to move student loan to these folks and they can do it better. What do you think? Is there any merit to this notion that, for example, the Treasury could do student loans better than the Department of Education?
I don't think so. And also I think many of us would agree, absolutely, there are things that could be done better, particularly with regard to federal student loans, even as a department as it was. And we would really want to focus on that, focus on improving what we have instead of trying to create more bureaucracy and changing it and creating different systems. Figure out what works, figure out how to make it how to make it easier for borrowers, institutions, even servicers, right, to actually manage this system and manage this debt. Instead of spending time trying to move it somewhere and then they have to figure it out, we're still going to have $1.6 trillion in debt. We're still going to have 43 million people struggling with debt. So we have to figure out how to address that, not where it's housed.
I have one just sort of existential or original sin question. For a long time, I've thought that one of the challenges is at the very beginning, it was good that we kept local control of curriculum, but the notion that we were going to fund schools based on local real estate taxes. Any of you got a great idea about what we do in the next 100 years in terms of how we fund education? Because I certainly look at the Virginia that Congressman Scott and I have represented, world of difference between Fairfax County and the Southwest Virginia or Southside Virginia. So,
I think if we're going to equitably fund education, and some states have been leading the way in really addressing funding based on the student's needs. So if you're a student with disabilities, or if you're a student who needs language, if you're a student who needs additional tutoring and supports around learning how to read by third grade, right? All of those things require targeted resources from the federal, state, and local level. I think we have to figure out at the local level different ways in terms of how local school districts provide revenue to address those weights that we need around student needs. But at least at the federal level, the role the federal government has always played is providing those targeted supports to students in greatest need, as I said before. And so I think it has to be the federal government's role, one, to ensure that we increase funding overall for education so that every kid has access and resources to a quality education, but then provide incentives for states and localities to fund education differently, and it has to be based on student need. And if you do it by property taxes or where you live, we know who's going to lose out, and that's typically Black, brown, and low-income students. So we have to flip it on its head. We have to make sure that we are giving resources to kids who need it most and making sure that the federal government leads the way in incentivizing and maybe in some ways mandating that districts and schools do better.
Can I do one more question, Mr. Chairman? So the Bible says without vision the people will perish. So my favorite statistic of last year, not favorite, but most striking, is that a college-educated teacher makes 50% what a college-educated non-teacher makes in this country. So how do I just love the ideas of imagining a world where teacher pay meets up with the impact that teachers have on our culture, on our society, on our economy, on our democracy.
Absolutely, and I imagine a world where not only does it match up, those teachers aren't saddled with so much student debt that it makes their salaries go even. It makes their salaries even less helpful, right? So we know that many teachers have to get master's degrees, and that's going to be out of reach because of some of these changes. We know they have to take on more and more student debt. It's disproportionate women, black women, who are taking this on, and so that's why even the student loan policy matters. So it's not just the salaries, but then what they can do with their salaries and how they can put their salaries to use.
And I would also add, I think teachers and educators are the most important profession in our society. It allows me to be sitting here with the education that I have, the opportunities I've been provided. It's because of the educators who invested in me and poured in me. But the most important thing, not only in terms of pay, they should be paid equally as any tech giant or any lawyer or doctor, right? But then we also got to make sure that we're providing them the supports once they enter the profession that they'll stay. And pay is one piece of that, but also the conditions in the work environments that they work in and providing mentorship and other supports so they can grow in their craft. And then I think we also have to recognize, right, their mental health, what they are going through. It's not easy teaching in today's environment, how politically charged it is, all the types of other expectations that are placed on our educators. And so I think we have to also recognize the mental health supports that educators need. So it's a combination of paying them adequately, providing the professional supports once they're in the school building and teaching in front of our kids, and then also paying attention to their mental health and supporting them in that along the way.
Thank you very much. I really appreciate your advocacy.
Thank you. And your question before that about funding goes to really the core reason we have the Department of Education. It's access. It's not curriculum, as it's already been pointed out. We don't do curriculum. But in 1954, we gave access through the Supreme Court. In 1964, Title I of the Elementary and Secondary Education Act addressed the fact that we funded with the real estate tax, so low-income areas got additional funding. IDEA, those with disabilities, English as a second language, racial achievement gaps. So those are the kinds of things that make sure that education is available to all. Ms. Harrington, we talked about student loans and all the different kinds of programs and why someone coming in really wouldn't have a clue as to what to do with the student loan portfolio. We didn't even mention the fact that part of the portfolio is which colleges can even participate. And even within the college, which programs, particularly community colleges, some programs qualify for student loans and others don't. And those that don't have this background obviously don't have a clue as to what would be talking about. Mr. Lee mentioned that on Title VI complaints, 90% were dismissed without an investigation. And Ms. Homer, you mentioned something about private right of action. Why is the fact that they are dismissed without an investigation, what does the Sandoval case have to say about that?
Testing me on my law school exam here. In general, when there is not a clearly articulated private right of action in the statute, as you say, the Sandoval case says that in general you can't sue. A private right of action has to be explicit.
So if they dismissed those cases without a investigation, if there's no private right of action under Title VI?
So to be clear, there is a private right of action under Title VI, just not for disparate impact claims. And so for like a racial harassment claim, there is a private right of action. And so you can still bring a case in court if OCR dismisses your case. But that's the reason that OCR is so powerful, is that most of these complaints are from students and parents, not lawyers, not groups like ours. And you can bring a case, you can have the federal government with a lawyer that knows the law walk you through what the facts are and where you need to be and what the school should have done, and you don't need to bring a costly case in court. And a Title VI case, if you don't have one of our groups bringing it, it's often very expensive to bring. There's not really a financial incentive for lawyers to do it, and so it's a prime place for the federal government to have a role.
But a lot of these cases are, in fact, disparate impact
And a lot of
cases,
them are disparate impact cases.
because you're talking about practices where the only people you look and the only people that got kicked out of school were African American, and you want to bring a case, it's dismissed without an investigation. That's it. So, Mr. Mays, you mentioned the voucher scheme. Do you have any idea how much that thing's going to cost?
There have been some estimates as much as $50 billion, but on average, most organizations who do this type of analysis have said it's between $30 and $50 billion. And when you compare that to Title I, right, which is close to $15 billion annually, it's going to have a huge impact in terms of a drain.
Title I is the major funding for local education under the Elementary and Secondary Education Act.
Yeah.
And you're saying 10 to 15 billion, and this thing is going to cost 30 to 50?
Yes, and it's only going to benefit, families, wealthy families, who either already homeschool their child or already send their kid to a private school.
And the Institute of Education Sciences, what good is that?
To me, it's everything. Data and understanding what practices and interventions need to be taken to scale and under what local context. That's what IES does, right? They provide not only reports and studies that sit on a shelf, but they're actually used by educators, administrators, technical assistance providers, organizations like mine, to really understand what the data says about how students are progressing and growing within a particular educational area. And then it allows us to point to and shine a spotlight on the inequities. And if you take that away, we know what's going to happen, right? You're going to have ideology drive policy and practice as opposed to evidence and data doing that.
Questions?
I just want to follow up on something that Mr. Baer said about education funding. I know that when you talked about we have to look differently at these funding formulas and what they look like, and in some cases mandate, I think the initial mandate of IDEA that the federal government would support 40% of the cost of that. I know at the local level, most local communities deal with their education budget first because that's the largest chunk of the local budget. So even when you take out whether it's a suburban and urban area, it's still the largest chunk. So thoughts on, if IDEA was fully funded at the 40% that Congress promised, districts can make some very different choices on other things, but we already have education mandates that are unfunded that districts have to do whether the money comes or not. And I think that creates this snowball effect as to how they proceed. Any thoughts on that one?
I think, to your point, I think this current environment that we're operating in, where we have an administration who is ignoring or circumventing federal law, ignoring and circumventing the federal role in education in terms of providing the necessary resources, right, for students to be able to access a quality education. And so to your point, I feel like we've seen a lot of state leaders and local leaders at the district and school level have to make budget decisions where if you're under resource district, not only are you not getting enough resources from local funding streams and state funding streams, but you rely heavily on the federal piece to close the gap. And because of that, they've had to, districts, as you know, teachers, as you know, don't stop in terms of their planning. They move forward. And so they have to make tough decisions because of the uncertainty at the federal level, and they have to make cuts to staffing, CUSTA programs and services. So it's essential, sorry.
But it's not just districts that are underfunded. Some of the things that we've seen in Connecticut is even districts that are more well-resourced, their speech therapists, their social worker are coming from neighboring districts because they don't have enough to hire that singular person in their district, but the services are still required. So we've seen where districts are sharing one person who's driving all over the state to provide those essential services and not understanding beginning to understand that this affects everyone, not just Title I districts.
Right.
And then one other thing, just to follow up on what you just said about long-term planning, when we had that initial government shutdown, one of the things that the Secretary and the department was touting was that there was no interruption in services. But anyone who works in education, public, private, anything, you don't plan week to week. You don't budget week to week. Many of those decisions were made in April of the year before.
Exactly.
So the impact is not immediately felt by people, and they were able to ride that as there was no effect on public education because of the government shutdown as a reason that we don't need it.
Mm-hmm.
But you all know this.
I want to thank our panelists for being with us. Ed Trust provides research and advocacy. Legal Defense Fund and Democracy Forward have been providing the litigation, keeping things in track. It was suggested we do as much oversight as we can. That is difficult coming from the minority. We do what we can. But part of the oversight is having hearings like this where we can expose what's going on. So this isn't going to be the last time we have a hearing. I look to see you in a couple of weeks to see if we've made any progress. And thank you for all that you do.